Hi, Michael Batchelard here, the host of Trial by Water. Before we get into today's episode, I want to let you know how you can access episode 3 of Trial by Water right now. If you already subscribe to The Age or Sydney Morning Herald, simply search Trial by Water episode 3, or go to theage.com.au or smh.com.au/podcast/Trial by Water. If you're not a subscriber to The Age or Sydney Morning Herald, you can sign up there in seconds. Otherwise, the next episode will be available in your podcast feed of choice on Saturday, June 22nd. Okay, on to today's episode. Lawyers love a good metaphor. If you've ever tried reading a legal judgment, you soon realise how convoluted it can get. So over the centuries, the courts have come up with various analogies to try to explain some of these concepts more simply. A lawyer wildly subpoenaing everyone for evidence in the hope of finding something is said to be on a fishing expedition. Or evidence produced by a witness who's been beaten up or whose phone's been illegally tapped is ruled out of court as the fruit of the poison tree. Metaphors are important when you're dragging 12 people out of their ordinary lives, putting them in a box and calling them a jury. And it's particularly crucial they know what's going on when, like in Robert Farquharson's case, the accused could end up in prison for more than 3 decades. I really like the metaphor used in this trial. It captures the concept perfectly. It describes how a prosecutor can weave a whole bunch of disparate threads of evidence together to form a single coherent story. It's what's called a Strands of the rope case. In cases like this, no single strand or thread of the evidence can carry enough weight on its own for a jury to say the accused is definitely guilty. But, woven together, the rope is strong enough, metaphorically, to hang you. Remember in the first episode when we asked 2 journalists who covered the trial which particular piece of the evidence convinced them that Robert Farquharson was guilty?
He showed the jury how far on a steering wheel you would have to turn the wheel to get that far. At that point, all my doubt would have been erased.
He stood there and asked for cigarettes. I just couldn't comprehend that from any human, let alone the father of those boys.
Katie and Kate both identified strands that to them were things you couldn't just explain away, but they were different strands. Now, in this case, different courts and judges have cut and sliced the important strands in different ways, but I reckon there are 6. Each represents an attempt by the prosecution to explain either how Robert Farquharson deliberately killed his children or why he did it, the motive. 3 of the strands could loosely be called scientific, and 3 more, human. They involve witnesses and the interpretation of his behaviour, including, importantly, his character. But there are a few people, lawyers, scientists and academics, who now think the whole case was too flimsy to convict Farquharson. But to make any serious attempt to check this, we'll need to deal with all the strands, one by one. This episode, I'm going to talk about the first 3, the science. From the newsrooms of The Age and the Sydney Morning Herald, this is Trial by Water. I'm Michael Batchelard. This is episode 2, Strands of the Rope. At the end of the last episode, I told you how the police were growing increasingly suspicious of Robert Farquharson after they interviewed him at Geelong Hospital. Here's what happened next. When Senior Sergeant Jeff Smith left the hospital and travelled back to the dam, his colleagues at the scene told him Farquharson had refused to participate in the search for his sons. On his trip to the scene, Sergeant Smith had already had one conversation with the homicide squad. So, with the possibility of murder on his mind, he started making a list.
I made a list, and on the top of the list I put he did it or he didn't do it. And on the left-hand side of the list, I had a whole list of things that I wrote down which pointed towards him. And then I started in the he didn't do it. And I was really hard pressed, and the only thing I could come up with on the he didn't do it side was, who could be this evil?
From there, things moved fast. Less than 24 hours after the death of the three Farquharson boys, an important meeting was held in the St Kilda Road headquarters of Victoria Police.
We had an office briefing within homicide with the inspector, and then basically that Monday it was decided that it would become a homicide squad investigation. And therefore...
That's Detective Gerard Clancy. He's talking to Luke McMahon, the lawyer we met in the first episode. In 2017, Luke was considering making a podcast about this case, and he interviewed Clancy, who ran the investigation for the homicide squad.
The examination by the attending members indicated that there was no innocent explanation at this stage that, or any stage, in relation to why the vehicle went off the road into the dam.
In other words, you weren't buying the coughing fit.
It looks like the officer in charge of the case never bought Farquharson's explanation that he'd coughed and blacked out.
No, that explanation didn't fit the circumstances.
And the motive? Who, in Sergeant Jeff Smith's words, could be this evil? For another accident investigator, Brad Peters, it was clear. To him, Farquharson had given it away with his desire after he got out of the dam to go and see his ex-wife, Cindy Gambino. This is Peters talking to Luke.
All he wanted to do was go to Cindy's place because he wanted, I think, just my opinion for what it's worth, he couldn't wait to tell her. He couldn't wait to see her reaction to losing the three things in life that she valued more than anything.
To police, this looked like revenge.
When you look at the situation of the relationship, the motive is it's payback, because what's the worst thing that he can do to Cindy is to take the children away.
At this point, though, all the police have is their suspicions. There are no witnesses and very little forensic evidence. So they start with what they have. They go into every aspect of Farquharson's meagre story and see what's plausible and what's not. What they start with is the cough. Robert Farquharson's case was the first time most people in Australia had ever heard of cough syncope, even though it's been described in the medical literature for almost 150 years. It's a pretty rare condition that happens when a person coughs so hard that they pass out. Scientists think it's because the pressure in your chest stops enough blood flowing to the brain. And syncope? It's just a fancy word for fainting, really. But in Farquharson's story, the importance of this little-known medical phenomenon can't be overstated. If he was telling the truth, that he coughed and passed out, then he can't be accused of murder. You're not capable of carrying out a sinister plot to kill someone if you're unconscious at the time. When it came to the trial, the cough syncope argument turned into a battle of the physicians. On the prosecution side, the main witness was Matthew Norton. His credentials took 28 minutes for the prosecutor in the second trial to recite. Head of General Respiratory and Sleep Medicine at the Alfred Hospital, a Fellow of the Royal Australian College of Physicians, and Adjunct Professor of Medicine at Monash University. 100 articles published, several quoted by others more than 150 times. At one point, the prosecutor, Andrew Tinney, who's now a judge, paused the recitation to ask theatrically, "What's the best way for you to be addressed in court? Is it doctor or professor?" You get the picture. This is an impressive guy. Experts play a special role in courts. While most witnesses have to stick strictly to the facts, "This is what I saw," experts can offer an opinion. And the clear impression the prosecution was delivering with Norton was, this is a bloke whose opinion you can't ignore. And if you really want to know about sleep disorders, that would be true of Norton.
Men who sleep less than 6 hours are sleep deprived. In men, we believe that 7 to 8 hours sleep allows the body's...
We can't talk to Norton. He declined our request for an interview. But you can hear him here on the Alfred Hospital's YouTube channel, providing what sounds like sage advice to men about the importance of sleep.
The importance of sleep is to clear the toxic proteins from the brain so that it prevents the development of memory loss and personality disorders.
On cough syncope, though, his credentials are much less impressive. He told the court at the first trial he'd never seen a patient with cough syncope. He hadn't published any papers on the subject. When he gave his first opinion to police, he'd read one sentence from a textbook and one scientific article and had talked to a few colleagues. And he hadn't examined Robert Farquharson. But Norton's lack of direct experience was no barrier to him producing an expert report for the prosecution. It's less than 3 pages long, and in it, he wrote it was extremely unlikely that Robert Farquharson suffered from cough syncope, which was an incredibly rare condition which he'd never seen. Remember the author Helen Garner? She sat through both trials, and she says that Norton portrayed cough syncope as something of, quote, almost mythological rarity. The defence hit back with its own expert, Chris Steinfort. Steinfort is the director of the Geelong Hospital's Lung Function Laboratory. At the time of the first trial, he testified that he'd seen or treated approximately 20 cases of cough syncope over 15 years. He was also the doctor who examined Robert Farquharson on the night of the crash. He concluded that Farquharson had, quote, classic cough syncope.
It would be inappropriate to call it a made-up condition because we found the first published report of cough syncope in 1876. And since then, there were hundreds and hundreds of cases published in the medical literature describing people with cough syncope. So there's no question that cough syncope exists or not. That's not even a question on the table.
That's Dr. Peter Dispinitis. We've gone to him because he's a professor of medicine at New York's Albert Einstein College of Medicine, and he's been researching coughs for more than 25 years.
I run one of the few chronic cough specialty centers really in the world, so I see people with chronic cough coming to see me. I have one patient who has cough syncope episodes almost every day because of a severe cough.
It's safe to say he knows more about cough syncope than just about anyone else.
I published in 2014 a review article on the topic of cough syncope, which remains the most exhaustive and up-to-date review on the topic that we currently have. So I probably have thought about this more than 99.9% of the doctors in the world.
He doesn't want to talk directly about the Farquharson case, though he's aware of it. It's just that he's not across the fine details, and he takes his responsibility as an expert very seriously. But the kind of person he describes as being particularly prone to the condition, well, he could be describing Robert Farquharson.
By far the most common type of person that's been reported over the last literally 150 years in the medical literature has been a short and stocky man with lung disease. So if you take someone who's, let's say, a short, stocky man who's a setup for cough syncope, they either have documented lung disease or are likely to have lung disease because they are a chronic smoker, for example. And then on top of that, they're in the midst or have recently had a common cold. Those three things all together would make it more likely that they have narrowed airways, they have more severe lung obstruction at the time of the coughing episode, and therefore making it even more likely that an episode of coughing could lead to cough syncope.
If all of those conditions were present, would it be accurate to say that cough syncope was an incredibly rare or an extremely unlikely event for such a person?
I think, well, the scenario I just painted would be a scenario which is very consistent with the occurrence of an episode of cough syncope.
There were also people who'd actually seen Farquharson cough and pass out, or get faint, on 6 different occasions before and after Father's Day 2005. The most colourful was Michael Eames. He was a prisoner with Farquharson for a while in Port Phillip Prison. I'm going to read from his police statement, which he gave while he was still inside. Since the incident, they call me Snowy the Widowmaker. You've got to laugh each day, and I tell lots of jokes. If I got paid for the jokes, I'd say I'd get $200 per week, not $31 per week. Eames clearly takes his responsibility as an entertainer pretty seriously. The statement continues. I was telling jokes all around the table and everyone was laughing. Robert Farquharson had been laughing for some time. We'd been telling jokes for a fair bit of the morning. I was halfway through the next joke and Robert was still laughing and started coughing. I didn't take any notice. Then all of a sudden, out of the corner of my eye, I saw him leaning over. His head was about at my shoulder height, and he was no longer coughing. He passed straight behind me. I remember the sound. It was his head hitting the floor. It was bone on concrete. I stood up. His face was red. I gave him a shake and he turned his head to me slowly. His eyes looked like ice looking nowhere. He was quite stunned. He was out for about 5 to 7 seconds. He said, "What happened, mate?" I said, "What happened to you?" He said, "I don't remember anything." I said, "I was telling a joke." He looked quite serious and said, "I don't even remember that." Eames gave evidence for Farquharson's defence in the second trial. Other witnesses, Farquharson's sister and his former employer, also said they'd seen him getting faint or passing out after coughing. Hearing these stories, maybe you're thinking, oh, he was just establishing an alibi. He made it all up. His friends and his mate in the prison were in on it. Well, maybe. But in the prison incident, Farquharson cracked his head open and broke his ankle. He didn't flinch. In the one in his sister's lounge room, she's a nurse, and she says he dropped like a bag of spuds. The other problem with this establishing an alibi theory is that there's no evidence that Farquharson knew any more about cough syncope before Father's Day 2005 than the rest of us. There were no records of him looking it up at the local library. He was asked about this by the prosecutor and said, "I haven't been near no libraries." What about the internet? Well, he had no computer and had never done a Google search. Once, when he wanted to look at cars, his brother-in-law had to set the computer up for him. And asked in court if Winchelsea had a place where a person could go to do an internet search, Farquharson said, "I don't know where you'd go to do that. I don't know." So who do we believe here? Garner declared the whole cough syncope argument a draw in the courtroom. And as usual, we can't tell what the juries thought. But I reckon that if they'd had a reasonable doubt about Farquharson's state of consciousness during the crash, they'd have been forced to acquit him. The fact they found him guilty twice makes me pretty sure that they thought the whole coughing and passing out story was made up, an excuse, a fantasy. Chris Brook has a view about this. He's the scientist we told you about in the first episode, and he wrote the book that first raised serious questions about the evidence in this case. I want to read you a passage from that book, Road to Damnation. Yes, it is possible that Robert Farquharson knew what cough syncope was, read specialised medical journals on the condition online or in a library, managed to cover all tracks of such endeavours, successfully faked a series of fainting episodes, fooling multiple people with an ability to remain totally unresponsive despite a broken leg and gashed forehead that was streaming blood. It is possible that his sister lied under oath with the support of her husband. It just seems more likely, at least to me, that he had cough syncope. A very simple explanation for all the evidence. Let's face it though, it just sounds fanciful, doesn't it? Too convenient, a bit unbelievable. But then I heard about the case of a truck driver, Jeffrey Ferguson. He was involved in a totally unrelated but eerily similar incident in 2015. That was a whole 10 years after Farquharson drove into the dam on Father's Day. So I tracked him down.
Hello, Jeff speaking.
G'day Jeff, it's Michael Batchelard here.
Hi Michael, how are you going?
I'm pretty well, thanks. How are you?
Not too bad, thank you.
In 2015, Jeffrey was working as a truck driver. He was good at his job, conscientious, describes himself as almost a teetotaler, and says he wouldn't take a day off sick unless he had 2 broken legs.
I was very sort of almost pedantic, I suppose, about sitting on the speed limits and trying to keep the truck in the correct position on the road all the time.
His job was to drive back and forth from Corowa in New South Wales to Shepparton, a couple of hours each way, to pick up loads of pork from the abattoirs and drop them off in cool stores.
It was probably one of the better jobs I'd ever had. So yeah, it was going well.
Then, on October 26, 2015...
On that day, I had got up that morning and I was feeling like I had a cold or a bit of a flu coming on, but it was not a lot. So I went off to work.
As the day wore on, though, he was feeling worse and worse, so he called his boss.
I thought to myself, it would be better if I was to see a doctor today and hopefully get some antibiotics and get on top of this flu thing that was coming on.
His boss told him there was nobody else to cover for him that afternoon. That was rubbish, Jeffrey says. So he called his brother, Stephen, to vent.
And then my brother says, I began to cough.
Jeffrey remembers none of this, but Stephen says he heard Jeffrey coughing hard, and then a wheeze at the last part of your lungs when you've emptied them and you've got nothing left to give. Stephen asked him if he was all right. No response. He asked it again, louder. Still no response. Then Stephen heard what he describes as a horrendous noise.
The first clear memory I have is I look up and I see a car coming straight at me. And the next thing I recall is there's dirt right outside the driver's window up against the glass. And I'm thinking, that's weird. Why is there dirt there? My brain couldn't grasp why there was dirt. That's not right.
Jeffrey couldn't grasp what was going on because he just lost consciousness. He had no idea he'd veered onto the other side of the highway and into the path of a car.
My next recollection was that I had all this stuff in the cab, it was on top of me, and I realised I'm on my side and I'm hanging in the seatbelt.
Jeffrey realised his only way out was through the passenger side door, which was more than 2 metres above him.
I did get through there eventually. I managed to get an arm out and the door was resting on the arm and I just forced my body out through the gap.
What he found outside was carnage. A number of cars pulled up, people running everywhere. Jeffrey swung into action.
Well, where's the driver? I could see somebody sitting in the driver's seat. So I went around that side of the vehicle to have a look, and it just looked like the man was sitting there in the driver's seat, arm out the window, resting over the mirror, and it just, for all the world, looked like he was asleep. And I went over there and discovered that he was dead already, and that I wasn't going to be able to help him at all.
Then the car caught fire. Jeffrey tried to get the man out, but the door was jammed shut, and he just had to watch him burn.
I was just devastated that this man was dead and there was nothing that anyone was going to be able to do to change it. It was done.
Then Jeffrey remembered a trucking friend's advice.
He'd always said to me, if anybody ever gets killed, he said, someone dies, someone's going to jail.
If someone dies, then someone's going to jail.
And that always stuck in my mind.
Jeffrey says other bystanders were calling 000, so he called his mate and then a lawyer who told him to cooperate with the police.
That was the word he used, cooperate with the police. And anyway, it turned out that was the worst advice I ever got.
Eventually, Jeffrey went to see a specialist, Dr. Chris Steinfort. Steinfort interviewed Jeffrey and his brother Stephen and told them,
absolutely, that is an episode of cough syncope without a doubt. So once I realised that it was an actual medical thing that had occurred, I honestly thought, and I recall my father said to me when I was telling him about the accident and how it had happened and what I'd learned about cough syncope and that, and he said, oh, you won't go to jail.
He was wrong.
Before I was actually even arrested at the scene, I was standing there and I do recall that the officer that arrested me, he said to a colleague who was standing beside me, oh, he fell asleep. It's like I wasn't there, they were saying, oh, he fell asleep. He fell asleep. So they started off in their mind that I was guilty. It was no innocent till proven guilty. They started off, this man's died. Now this guy's the one that did it. How do we prove his guilt so we can get him locked up? That was their attitude, and they absolutely went about doing that.
And I want to note that from this point on, Jeffrey's case starts to bear some remarkable similarities with Farquharson's. Like, guess who the experts were in court? Police asked Professor Matthew Norton to give evidence for the prosecution, and once again the defence called Christopher Steinfort. There were other similarities too. Police criticised how Jeffrey had acted after the crash. He didn't dial 000, for one thing, and in court they implied he was callous, just didn't care. And like Farquharson, Jeffrey also could not answer in detail any police questions about what had happened to him. His memory is just missing for a chunk of time, in this case starting well before the actual coughing began. In Jeffrey's case, it took less than 2 hours for the jury to return its verdict. Guilty.
Unanimous. Guilty, all charges.
Even though his brother gave eyewitness evidence of the coughing fit, then the silence, then the crash, they simply did not believe the coughing story. He was sentenced to 7 years for culpable driving causing death and a raft of more minor charges.
I wanted to yell out, "You've got it wrong. Like, I am innocent. I didn't do this. I couldn't stop it from happening. It was beyond my control. There wasn't a thing I could do about it."
In prison, Jeffrey Ferguson found a lawyer who was prepared to take on his case. They lodged an appeal, and it's around about here that his story starts to differ from Robert Farquharson's. In the appeal, Jeffrey's barrister argued that the jury simply shouldn't have ignored the medical evidence of cough syncope. And he pointed out that at the trial, the prosecution's star witness, Matthew Norton, had been forced to backtrack during cross-examination. Norton conceded that maybe Jeffrey had been unconscious, though he still thought he might have fallen asleep. When the day of judgment came...
Well, that was very interesting. It was very quick.
The appeal court judge's decision was clear.
The amount of time that the judge spoke for was probably 15, 20 seconds, maybe. So the next thing I know is my barrister turns around, his big grin on his face, and he said, "So how does it feel to be a free man?" And I said, what just happened? And he said, "Well, you've won."
Reading the appeal court judgment, something really struck me. Cough syncope is a recognised condition. It was first named in 1876. The Driver and Vehicle Licensing Agency in the UK recognises it as a condition that creates danger on the roads. But still, people, including lawyers, look at you like you're a simpleton when you plead it.
There is no way to predict that someone is going to have an episode of cough syncope before they have their first episode.
Here's Peter Dispinitis again.
And your first episode can happen at age 50, at age 60. It can happen while you're driving a car. It can happen while you're waiting for the train, sitting next to the tracks. Or hopefully you'd have it at home where there's a sofa nearby, So there's no examination before, during, or after to do. The issue is seeing someone coughing and then fainting, and that's called syncope.
And in the absence of a medical test for it, people, even some doctors, and certainly lawyers, struggle to believe it actually exists. Jeffrey Ferguson's case is a great example of this. The prosecutor, talking about cough syncope, asked the jury at one point, "Are you going to fall for that?" Later he said, "Don't be duped for a minute by this cough syncope." This is not the kind of thing barristers are supposed to say. The three judges called the prosecutor's words inflammatory and emotive, and, quote, "a contravention of his responsibility to the court and to the system of justice." In the polite language of the law, this was a humiliating public dressing down. Jeffrey Ferguson walked out of the court and into a new life that day. But the experience has taken a permanent toll. An innocent man died on his watch, which weighs heavily on Jeffrey. He was wrongly imprisoned, he lost his job and can no longer work. All this means he suffers post-traumatic stress disorder. He lives in a cottage out the back of his sister's place and barely leaves it. And he missed one of the most important days of his life.
While I was in prison, I got a phone call from my brother to say that my father had passed away. We were friends as well as being father and son. He was my best man at my wedding, so that's how close we were. And so he passed away thinking I was a convicted criminal.
There was one other curious similarity with the Farquharson case, and it was pivotal to both. It's the second strand of scientific evidence, and it's about the way their vehicles moved on the road before they crashed.
They determined that the truck had had some steering input, and in saying that I had positively steered the truck, I couldn't have been unconscious. That was their argument.
In both cases, the police said the way their vehicles moved on the road meant they must have been actively steering.
I found out they said the same thing about Robert Farquharson's, that he had steered the vehicle, and then they're saying, no, he didn't have an episode of cough syncope because he had steered the vehicle. In his case, same story.
But is this true? It turns out that's a complicated question. But to even start making sense of it, we wanted to go to where it all began, the dam. That's after the break. So we're just approaching the overpass that goes over the railway line, and on the other side of that is the dam that we're interested in looking at. This is the overpass that Rob Farquharson drove over on Father's Day 2005. We're on the road from Geelong to Winchelsea, an hour-and-a-half drive southwest of Melbourne. It's the town where Farquharson and his wife Cindy and her new boyfriend Stephen Moulls all lived in 2005. 4 or 5 kilometres short of the town, just off to the right of the Princes Highway, is the dam at the centre of this story. Today, it's silent, plain and benign looking. Sort of farmland, it's dry. There's, little properties and windbreaks. The scenery is much the same as it was back when the crash happened, but some things have changed. The road is new. We're on a divided road now. Back in 2005, it was just one road each way. So I've just had to go past the dam, and we're doing a... I'm with my producer, Ruby. As we get out of the car and approach the dam... Let's get out and go and have a look. The first thing we notice is a memorial to Jay, Tyler and Bailey. Now what we're looking at here is 3 crosses, and stuck to one of the arms of the crucifix is a picture of Cindy, who also died in 2022. Yeah. I wonder if the family comes here sometimes and has a look and tends to the memorial. I don't know. As for the dam itself, it looks pretty ordinary, but it's not. This is not your average watering hole for livestock. It's actually an old quarry. The dirt and rock dug out from here built the railway overpass we've just driven over. And that means it's deep, really deep, and steep-sided. It also means it's pretty close to the road.
How many metres would you say it's between the road and the dam?
I reckon 15 metres. Does that seem about right to you? According to the police, it took probably about 2.6 seconds from the car to go from the edge of the road and into the water. So there were days and days and days of evidence about this at the trial, and what they were arguing about was about 2.6 seconds. I was wrong there, as it happens. It was 2.9 seconds. The man in charge of working out what happened in those seconds was Acting Sergeant Glenn Urquhart and his team at Victoria Police's Major Collisions Investigation Unit. He was a serving police officer with a brace of qualifications, and he'd investigated 300 crashes. It didn't hurt that in court, Urquhart was a charmer. Helen Garner makes him sound like Chesty Bond, tall, fair and broad-shouldered, with a noble head and reasonable expression. The conclusions that Urquhart drew were absolutely pivotal, not just to Farquharson's conviction, but to the decision to prosecute him in the first place. This is the second strand of evidence. It's called the traffic reconstruction, and it gets very technical very quickly. Even the judge in the first trial complained at one point about 3 days talking about tufts of grass. The main points are these. At the scene, there was not a lot of hard evidence. All they had was a small patch of long grass that had been flattened by the car driving over it, a wire fence the car broke through, and some debris it left as it clipped a tree on the way to the dam. Urquhart based his conclusions on this, as well as some yellow paint marks at the side of the road. They were painted by Geoffrey Exton, another police officer, on the night of the crash, and he said they indicated where Farquharson's car had driven off the road. Out of all this, he concluded that the only way Farquharson could have made the short journey to the dam was if he was conscious and had made 3 distinct steering inputs.
Acting Sergeant Glenn Urquhart said the car was steered by 3 distinct steering movements before entering the dam.
Said police reconstruction which showed steering corrections from road to dam.
It's a phrase that made multiple headlines and newspaper posters over the years of this case. With its clear implication of active driving, it was devastating to Farquharson.
He told the court the car moved off the road to the right, then straightened before moving right again and narrowly missing a tree.
According to Urquhart, the first input was to get the car off the road. He said it was a huge 220-degree turn to the right.
This steering wheel used in court to demonstrate that Farquharson had to turn the wheel 220 degrees to replicate the car's dramatic right turn, an impossible task.
In the first trial in 2007, prosecutor Jeremy Rapke whipped out a prop to demonstrate. He said you'd have to either cross your arms or take a hand off the steering wheel to achieve a turn of that size. The second turn, Urquhart said, was to the left, to correct the initial lunge off the road, and a third to the right to avoid the tree. But as time went on, it became clear that much of the evidence that underpinned his opinion was either unknowable or wrong. Over the course of 2 trials, the police abandoned some of it themselves, and some of it they conceded in cross-examination. It turns out Exton's marks were painted at the wrong angle and too close together. Urquhart didn't measure the hill down from the road to the dam, and he hadn't measured the camber of the road the way it slopes. And he didn't include the effect on the car of hitting the fence or the peculiarities of Farquharson's old Holden Commodore. His mechanic said it tended to drift to the right. In the second trial, Urquhart abandoned the 220-degree turn. He also acknowledged for the first time that an unsteered vehicle on that terrain might well drift towards the dam. But through both criminal trials, under days-long cross-examination, Urquhart stuck to his key point, at least 3 steering inputs. We asked him for an interview, but he declined our request. He's no longer with the police. He left his job after this case. To counter the police evidence, the defence called its own expert, David Axup. In his theory, the car could have drifted into the dam with an unconscious driver. But all this took eye-glazing hours, days to explore. Radii, yaw, camber, crossfalls, aggregate angles. Helen Garner describes the effect on the jury. She says the air of the court became a jelly of confusion and boredom. No matter how earnestly I strove to grasp it, she wrote, the traffic reconstruction evidence was fiddly, manically detailed, and catastrophically lacking in narrative. It made me, and by the looks of them, the jury, feel panicky and stupid. So, in an attempt to get a definitive answer, we've asked yet another expert, Shane Richardson. I want to know once and for all, were there 3 steering inputs? And therefore, was Farquharson conscious?
My name's Dr. Shane Richardson. I'm an engineer. I've been doing forensic crash investigations since 2002.
The walls in Shane Richardson's office, in an industrial park near the airport, are not decorated with paintings of flowers or pastoral scenes. They are lined with huge framed portraits of cars mangled beyond recognition and gigantic military and construction vehicles. Shane himself is a shortish, middle-aged man. He pads down the stairs in his socks to escort us to his workstation, which looks like the command centre for an aircraft carrier.
Yes. Yeah.
He's chatty, charming, and totally obsessed with car crashes.
There's a guy by the name of Haddon who got into looking at crashes ages ago, and one of the things that Haddon put forward was a matrix of crash events. The pre-events, the crash events, the post-crash events. but it's the environment.
Which, by the way, are definitely crashes, not accidents. So it's really kind of reconstructing a mishap or an accident.
Yes. They'd like to call them accidents, they're crashes.
To explain what went on. Some of what he says is frankly baffling.
It's done at critical speed yaw, so it's not us that are left with the point A and point B or point A and point F. They didn't set the same camber, they didn't set the same inclination on the tyres, they didn't use the same tyres.
It makes me feel sympathy for the jury. Shane Richardson has given evidence in hundreds of court cases, mostly for the defence. He's done a bunch of work on Farquharson's case, and he's seen the evidence that both sides gave. I ask him, to what extent, I guess this is almost a philosophical question, to what extent is the technical stuff that you spent years doing explicable to ordinary people like juries and even lawyers?
I've got to say I've been involved in cases where it's been really well done and sometimes it's not well done. There's danger with oversimplifying, but there's also danger with becoming so technical that you just bamboozle people.
Wary of being bamboozled myself, I ask him straight out. So in this particular case, what do you think happened?
Look, for a reason, there's been a steering input to the right. Then the vehicle's dropped off the embankment, then it's run through a fence, and then it's gone into the dam. That's what I can say.
Could it, when you say steering input, just to be clear, is that necessarily a conscious input by a person, or could it have drifted because of the camber of the road and the quality of the vehicle?
I can't discount that it's a possibility that it's existed because of the camber of the road or the quality of the vehicle. I can't say, did the driver deliberately steer to the right? Was it a combination of the road and the condition of the tyres? I can't tell you that.
Once the car was off the road, though, Shane says there are some things in the landscape that would have changed what path it took.
Driving through the fence is one that I'd stand out and say, well, that's an input that could have occurred. The other is that as it comes off the embankment, there's going to be a change in direction. But there's no way to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that there were three distinct driver steering inputs to change the direction of the car when there are other factors that could explain that.
Or, in fact, any distinct driver inputs?
Yes, that's correct. I can't tell you that the driver did or did not do that. I can just say that there are two, at least, transitional events that could have changed the direction of the car.
I'm finding it frustrating trying to pin this down. I want some certainty here. But I guess what Shane Richardson is saying is that we'll never know for sure. We don't know which lane the car was in before it left the road. And once you cast doubt on the Exton marks, we don't even know where the car left the road or at what angle. So what we're left with is this. Yes, Farquharson might have driven deliberately into the dam. Or he might have drifted onto the wrong side of the road while coughing. Or maybe he'd slumped onto the wheel when he lost consciousness. But we can't know for sure. Science is like that sometimes. Often, actually. In our legal system, the people entrusted to make sense of doubt and science and dueling experts are juries. And if they're anything like journalists, they also crave certainty. Shane Richardson's developed a pretty strong opinion about this over the years he spent fronting police in the courts.
They develop a position really early on and they stick to it. Doesn't matter what the evidence, the objective, they just stick to their position because this is what we said. They're just bloody minded and their position is their position and that's it.
In Farquharson's case, the defence expert David Axup made concessions. Garner wrote that at one point, when Axup was being cross-examined, the prosecutor coaxed him into a position almost identical to Urquhart's. In its elegant way, she wrote, it was a massacre. As importantly, she also wrote about how he came across. And Axup, she says, was deeply unpleasant, inflexible and pedantic. By contrast, the police officer, Urquhart, stuck to his story. And in Garner's words, the jury liked him. They felt for him. He was one of the witnesses they instinctively trusted. For me, that raises the question, is that a good enough basis to send a man to prison? As we were packing up to leave Shane Richardson's office, he gave us 2 handy tips.
Go and get a dash camera, because it becomes this is what actually happened, not I think I did this or this.
And the second tip?
If you're ever in trouble, spend as much money as you possibly can on your barrister, because they're the ones that are going to make the arguments that are going to be listened to, rather than someone like me.
Now to the third and final scientific strand of evidence. What happened after the car entered the water?
Okay, the time is 12:43 on Tuesday, the 6th of August, 2005. This is Detective Senior Constable Andrews.
A few days after the crash, police went to collect Robert Farquharson from his father's place in Winchelsea to drive him to his first formal sit-down interview.
St Kilda Road in Melbourne. We want to get away from here because of all the media.
You need to look at that now.
We do, yes. Yeah.
Farquharson's sisters, Carmen and Kerry, are both there. They wanted to take Farquharson to the station with them, but police were adamant. He'd be in their car, alone. His sisters could follow along behind.
He's not going to be by himself. I mean, we're not ogres or anything else like that. We're totally, we're trying to understand, just like everybody else, is what Robert must be going through and everybody else, okay?
The reason is because the police were secretly recording the entire conversation. The audio quality isn't great, but you can make out Farquharson telling his version of events.
I honestly don't know where I was.
He says he'd just woken up from being unconscious. The kids were screaming. Jay, in the front seat, opened the door, but water gushed in, so Farquharson reached over and pulled it shut.
Shut the door so that water get loose.
Then he opened his own door and got out to try to help the kids. Suddenly he found himself underwater and the car was well and truly on its way to the bottom.
I remember just getting out and trying to get around the other side. And I thought, thinking, well, I didn't know how far deep, I didn't know nothing.
What Farquharson did know, though, was the sheer speed at which the car sank.
You can't tell, it was just like that, everything just went like that.
Just like that, he said, snapping his fingers.
We're after the truth, Robert. Yeah. That's what we want.
Yeah, that's telling you the truth. I've got no reason to rather.
That's all we want to find out. Exactly what happened.
Like most of us, the police didn't know what would happen to a car in water, so they set about finding out. If they could disprove Farquharson's version, they'd have caught their suspect in a pretty important lie.
So what I wanted to test was, if you put a car into water, what does it look like? Can you do the things that he said he did? Can you open the door up? Because
Here's Detective Sergeant Clancy, the homicide squad investigator in charge of the case. Again, he's talking to Luke McMahon.
So we consulted with our search and rescue, and they were keen to get on board to help us out. So we thought, well, why not try it?
Yeah.
To test his account.
They came up with an experiment. They'd take a car and drop it into a dam using a crane and try to open the doors. They'd capture the whole thing on video. The dam they found was on a property near Gordon, an hour northwest of Melbourne. For an experiment, though, it had a couple of major shortcomings.
Now, one of the limitations that we had in conducting the tests was because for a couple of those tests we were putting a diver into the car, we were limited on the depth of the water that we could do that.
The dam Robert Farquharson had driven into was 7.4 metres deep at the point where the car came to rest. By contrast, the dam the police chose for their experiment was just 2.8 metres deep. The car was 4.8 metres long. This didn't matter, the police told the court, because the point of the experiment was not to see how the car sank. The test was whether the doors could be opened. There were 3 phases to their experiment. In the first, they tested if the passenger side door could open and then close again. Then they tried opening the driver's door wide enough to let someone out. Turns out you could do all this. In the second experiment, they tested if the driver could open his door and get out of the vehicle. Sure could. Both experiments also showed something the police had perhaps not anticipated, the sheer violence with which the car sank. As soon as the door was opened, the water gushed in and the car took a nosedive, at least until it hit the mud at the bottom of the shallow dam. All this was played to the juries in Farquharson's 2 trials. In the minds of the defence team, those 2 videos alone were enough to show that Farquharson's story was checking out. But then something odd happened. A 3rd test began. The police diver said this test had been ordered unexpectedly on the day by Detective Gerard Clancy. This time, once again, the cameras inside and outside the car would be rolling, but there'd be no divers inside and the car doors would not be opened. The car is lowered into the water, and for a while it just sits there. At 2 minutes, the car has started to tip forward and the water's halfway up the driver's window. At 4 minutes, the car is apparently immovable. If you look really hard, the water is like the minute hand of a clock, slowly creeping up the back window. And it isn't until a full 8 minutes and 7 seconds that the boot finally sinks below the surface in a mess of bubbles.
I don't know anything about the accused, so I don't know what he's thinking, but as far as whether he loves his kids or not. But the bottom line is, once he opened that door, which is a natural reaction for many people, it's almost impossible for him to get his kids out of that car.
That's Dr. Gordon Giesbrecht. He's a retired professor from the University of Manitoba in Canada, and he's sunk dozens of cars, more than anybody else in the world. He's written 10 academic papers on the topic and even come up with an acronym about how to get out of a sinking car.
SWOC, seatbelts off, windows open, out immediately, children first.
Gordon says the 3rd police video is nothing like what would have actually happened to Farquharson once he opened the car door on the night of Father's Day 2005.
The demonstration was not done under the same conditions, water depth being the main thing, and therefore it'd be very, very misleading. And it is not sinking slowly like the 3rd demonstration. Absolutely nothing like the 3rd demonstration. That 3rd demonstration is completely useless as a demonstration of what happens for someone who's opened the door and gotten out.
Tell me what happens when a car is in deep water and one or more doors are opened.
I tell people all the time, if you open the door in a car in deep water, that car is going to sink. You might get out, but everybody else in the car is basically doomed.
Gordon says it would have taken seconds.
Like 5 seconds. It's very, very fast.
In 2005, people, including the police, just didn't know this. Gordon's first paper was only published 5 years later, in 2010. And before that, the only widely known example was an episode of the TV show Mythbusters, and they used a swimming pool. So it's fair to assume that Farquharson would not have known what to do.
He thinks if I open the door, I can get out, not knowing that when he opens the door, the vehicle is going to sink really quickly.
I asked Gordon, knowing what we know now, would that 3rd sinking video be shown to a jury?
Not in the context that it was. Absolutely not. If you're shown that video in the context that this is how much time he had, I mean, it's not even close to what would have happened.
But the jury was shown it in both trials, and it made a very strong impression. Here's what author Helen Garner had to say about it. I'm quoting her. "It was terrible, unbearable, visually so horribly vivid, just unthinkable. I can hardly even talk about it now, and I think that everyone in the courtroom was just speechless with horror." Even Lex Lasry, the judge in the 2nd trial, was traumatised by it. After the trial, he said that the police videos were the worst part. He couldn't read Garner's book, he said, because he never wanted to revisit them. To Detective Clancy, this video was one of his most effective pieces of evidence.
There were things that we did to investigate the veracity of the story. We found
This is Detective Clancy talking about the submergence video on the documentary Crimes That Shook Australia.
To me, that was very compelling, that you had time where you could collect your thoughts, collect the boys, work out a plan and say, this is how we're going to get out. He could have saved at least one of the boys.
Whether or not that was the intention of that third test, I think what Detective Clancy just said is exactly what everyone is thinking. People are imagining themselves as the three boys, trapped, helpless in the car, doomed as the water slowly engulfs them. Maybe they're also wondering, where the hell was the dad? We've asked for interviews with the police involved in this investigation. I'd like to put some of these questions to them directly. None of them wanted to speak. Instead, we got a statement from Assistant Commissioner Glenn Weir. It said Victoria Police stood by the rigorous investigation which led to Farquharson's conviction. They consider it finalised and won't comment any further. Which is a pity, because I do have some questions about the science in this case. And what I think I can say is this. Cough syncope is rare, but people do suffer from it, and a smoker like Farquharson, with a chest infection and a short, stocky build, is a prime candidate. To guide the jury were two experts saying completely different things. One had less experience, but a much better CV. For the traffic reconstruction, the police expert was charming, handsome, unwavering, and wearing a uniform. But his three-steering inputs theory was just that, a theory. It could not be stated with certainty. And to show the car sinking, the prosecution produced an experiment that packed a huge emotional punch, but was fundamentally misleading. None of this is to blame juries or ridicule anyone. The strength of the system is that we're human. It's that we're regular people, brought together to judge the facts using our common sense. But I guess we're all entitled to hope that the facts presented to juries are scientifically accurate and reliable. And experts have raised serious questions about some of the science used in this case. But it wasn't only scientific evidence in this trial. There were three more strands, what I'm calling the human evidence, and that's where things get even more complicated.
I have an excellent survivor. No, they don't. That's what you said to me.
I never said that. I had the piece of evidence that was missing in the puzzle.
Really what we're trying to do is just find out if Dawn Waite could have seen the things she said she saw.
She's saying everything that we've been saying right from the get-go.
That's next time. For additional content and additional reporting on the Farquharson case available to subscribers of The Age and the Sydney Morning Herald, visit The Age or smh.com.au/podcast/trial by water. Subscribe now to access the special Good Weekend investigation. It features never-before-seen 3D models recreating key scientific evidence, video, audio, and other interviews. Trial by Water is a production of The Age and the Sydney Morning Herald. It's hosted and reported by me, Michael Batchelard. Ruby Schwartz executive produced the series. She's also the head of investigative podcasts. Martin Peralta mixed the series. Editing from Patrick Elliott, The Age's editor, and Matthew Dunkley, the deputy and investigations editor. Additional reporting in this series from Nick McKenzie. Tom McKendrick is the head of audio and video. Chris Payne is the head of premium content. Special thanks to David McMillan and Martine Chaussard.